Howdy, this is our presentation on disaster mitigation in Hilo, Hawaii. Specifically, how can the city lessen the impacts of tsunamis for its people? So here's a map of Hawaii. As you can see, Hilo is on Hawaii's main island along the coast of the Pacific Ocean. It's along a bay on the northeastern side of the island and built directly on the water. This creates many factors as to why Hilo is especially vulnerable to tsunamis. Hilo is a geographically small bay community on the Hawaiian coast. It has a population of around 50,000 people and is relatively dense compared to the surrounding areas. After taxes, the average household income is around $60,000 per year. This is around the average across the country, but due to Hawaii's high cost of living, many people cannot afford purchases outside of the basic necessities. Also, over a third of the population is at or above the retirement age, which matters because older adults need extra help during evacuations or emergency situations. At the same time, Hilo faces some social challenges such as rising homeless populations with very little access to life-saving services if a disaster were to occur. These vulnerabilities, caused by the limited resources and access to transportation, means the damage caused by tsunamis could be significantly more tragic than it should be. So, that's why the people of Hilo are vulnerable to disaster, but geographically, Hilo needs a lot of attention too.
The main geographic concern that Hilo faces is that it sits in a bay. This bay acts like a bit of a satellite dish to concentrate the energy from an incoming tsunami into a very small spot, and it completely wipes out everything in its path because of this effect. And this bay is angled such that it can catch nearly any earthquake from the Aleutian Islands down to San Francisco and funnel it right into the population center. Also, most of Hilo is built within a floodplain, and it's very close to sea level, so the tsunami does not have to expend much energy to go inland. Also, 60% of the deaths from the 9 worst tsunamis that have hit Hawaii have been at Hilo, so it has a history of being bad.
So far, we've talked a lot about how Hilo is an area at very high tsunami risk, but we've yet to discuss what a tsunami actually is and why they're caused. But tsunamis are essentially just a giant wall of water caused by a massive vertical displacement of a substantial amount of ocean water. This is usually due to a variety of reasons, but they're most commonly caused by earthquakes, volcanoes, and landslides. In deep water, tsunamis move incredibly fast, almost as fast as airplanes, but as it approaches land and it becomes more shallow, the water slows down and the tsunami grows in height. Even relatively weak tsunamis are strong enough to move a few kilometers inland in certain areas, causing massive flooding and damage. Additionally, as water recedes back into the ocean, it drags any loose debris and soil back into the ocean, causing mass pollution along the coastlines of affected areas, which is particularly bad in areas like Hilo, where fishing along coastlines is very common. So, when looking into potential solutions for the town of Hilo, we first researched into some short-term solutions like tsunami platforms and survival capsules. In the case of tsunami platforms, they're raised structures up to 50 feet off the ground that give people in tsunami risk areas an immediate high ground they can escape to. These platforms can comfortably fit around 300 people with a max of 400, but a major limitation for these platforms is the cost they take to build, which isn't often feasible for local communities in tsunami risk, even though there are FEMA grants available for their construction. The other survival tool we looked into are the survival capsules, which are giant spheres designed to encapsulate and protect people from mass flooding events caused by rain and tsunamis. The sphere floats in water and provides insulated and waterproof environment for up to 4 people, but much like the tsunami platforms, an individual capsule is very expensive, and the amount needed for a large tsunami risk community would put too much of a financial burden on them, so ultimately we decided not to employ either of these strategies.
Our proposed mitigation technique is through the coral reef reconstruction through the actions of coral gardening, which involves collecting broken coral or coral that has fallen to the seafloor or is on a coral structure currently, where it's then broken off, brought to a coral nursery, and then nursed back to health, and then later reintroduced in areas that require it. We chose coral gardening because of the substantial coral population that is already in the area, especially in the Hilo Bay area, and how it produces actually a natural barrier against tsunamis, reducing energy by 60%, which is due to the causing of friction and the waves just breaking before it actually inundates the land and actually hits the shoreline. This currently can create a 5-minute delay at the best times, but any sort of delay in these situations is very helpful. Current techniques in Hilo, Hawaii involve the evacuation routes and shelters like the platforms, and because it is in America, it is falls under a zoning and building code.
Well, now that we kind of know how it breaks waves and breaks down the energy, you're probably wondering, where are we going to physically plant this coral for core gardening, and how much is it going to cost? The cost itself is actually quite substantial. It's about $500,000 for 2.5 acres of physical coral gardening. And it doesn't sound feasible, but we're not really trying to rebuild the entirety of the bay. We're really just focused on these specific low density areas within what's we're considering is the spine of this mass of coral in Hilo's Bay, which you can kind of see. There's almost like a nice line of higher density coral population, and then there's a big green pocket that really needs to just kind of be rebuilt up. So the plan is to just go through, find those low density pockets along the center of the reef, pack them with coral, reassess in a couple of years, and then, obviously pack the next low density areas over time to create a massive underwater wall to really absorb a lot of that force. Now, because it's so expensive, it's really just kind of out of the price range of the average citizen. So unfortunately here, the government does have to step in. Well, not unfortunately, but fortunately the government here can step in and implement sizable tax on the coral tourism industry to fund the entire thing. Now, the coral tourism industry in particular, we're focusing on taxing them because it makes up a sizable amount of Hawaii's economy. We can make anywhere between $3 to $8 million a year, which ends up being about 15 to 40 acres of coral that we can plant every year at just like a 1% tax rate, assuming that consumption doesn't decline. Now, that caveat of consumption is really, really important because the secondary effects of taxes are going to help aid our main mitigation technique. So tourism and coral are actually heavily inversely related, found by a gentleman named Greg Asner. He really just discovered kind of what we already know and mapped it out quite a bit, which isn't on here, but on the left, he found that there's a lot of human interaction leads to a lot of coral decline. And you can see that on the map. On the left is the human interaction. On the right is the density of the coral and lack thereof in the high interaction areas. And because taxes actually make things more expensive and people just don't want to buy more expensive things, consumption goes down. So in this case, the tourism to these reefs are going to go down. And by virtue of that, over time, they will decline less rapidly, and it will help us rebuild the reef much more quickly.
Yeah, so why exactly are these taxes feasible here in Hilo? Well, essentially, the coral reefs are a major economic asset in Hawaii, as my buddies mentioned before. Each year, the reefs contribute about $360 million in net benefits to the state's economy. And a huge portion of that, about 85%, comes from tourism and recreation, which is essentially stuff like snorkeling, diving, guided tours, stuff you would think about when people go and visit these coral reef areas. And essentially, people are just paying to experience these ecosystems, which, in fact, around 60% of Hawaii's total tourism revenue is based directly from these coral reefs, which is why their health is extremely important. And on top of that, being near the coral reefs, just in general, increases property values a ton, which makes coastal areas much more desirable and extremely profitable, which is precisely why we are able to tax the coral reef industry. So taxes on these coral reefs are indeed feasible. This has been our presentation on Hilo, Hawaii and tsunami mitigation techniques. Thank you for listening and watching. And here are our research links.